And good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. Thank you for giving us a little bit of your time, whether you're with us live or you're joining us at a later time on watching the Facebook recording. I'm Corey Saylor. I am the Research and Advocacy Director with CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations. And we're just going to spend a couple of minutes together looking at our Q4 2023 data set and giving you some insights into what we're seeing as a result of collecting this data from all across CAIR as an institution. So I'm going to share my screen with you, if you will bear with me for a second while I bring that up. All right. And so you're going to see our complaints data for the Q4 of 2023. And before we dive into this, just how do we do this? What happens is that as complaints come into CAIR, either at the headquarters office where I work or our different chapters, usually the first set of eyes on them is an attorney who will assess the case, and then we'll talk to the potential client and kind of get the details of the case. And what happens is that those intake officers categorize each of these types of case for us. And then every year, all of that information is sent to us at the headquarters for us to assess. So if you've been following our data updates since the Gaza genocide started, we've just been doing those very quickly. This is an extract from our full 2023 data set, which we'll be releasing in April. But to get to the purpose and the meat of today's conversation, that extract tells us a couple of things. October, November, December of 2023 saw a relentless wave of bias targeting American Muslims, Palestinians, Arabs, but we primarily, as everyone knows, track that stuff affecting primarily people who are targeted because they are perceived as or are Muslims. So 3,578 total complaints in that last quarter of 2023, which represents a 178% increase over an equivalent period in 2022. And again, if you've been following our updates, we've been saying our belief that employment and education discrimination are standouts in this wave of anti-Muslim bias as compared to others. And now our data from all across CAIR backs that up. So in the Q3 of 2023, employment discrimination was the most frequently reported type of complaint to CAIR. And to give you an idea of what that can look like, we have a case in Maryland where a teacher had put a statement supporting Palestinians in her signature line. Other people employed by that same school district had done similar things about a variety of different issues. She was just the first person that administration had actually enforced a rule on that said you weren't supposed to do that. So this was a commonplace practice. She did it talking about Palestine, and then she was the one who was singled out. We've actually worked with her to file an Equal Opportunity Employment Commission discrimination case for her. Hate crimes, hate incidents were the next category. You've by now heard about the murder of a 6-year-old boy in Chicago. He was stabbed to death, allegedly by the person who owned the building or managed the building, while that person yelled anti-Muslim slurs. And then finally, education discrimination. This covers K-12 and higher education. We've talked primarily about higher education settings where students have faced pushback on holding their protests to stand up for Palestinian humanity. But I do want to call your attention to a specific case that we had or saw in Georgia, where a teacher threatened to cut the head off of a student after she criticized his Israeli flag. So these numbers that we talk about, these percentages that we talk about, there's a human being behind every one of those incidents. I just think it's important that we remember that. And that's why I want to give you those examples of real people going through real problems. And I will end our presentation today on just a fairly simple couple of thoughts about what we're seeing. Anti-Muslim bias, Islamophobia has been cyclic for years. And while many people have talked about the wave that we saw after 9/11, I think it's important to remember that that wasn't the only wave of anti-Muslim bias we face. The last one that we saw was December 2015, after then candidate Trump announced his plans to ban Muslims from the United States. We had a massive wave at that point. We've also seen waves around the 2010 midterm election. For those of you who were around back then, you might remember the Ground Zero Mosque. It went from being a debate in New York City about the placement of Islamic Cultural Center in Lower Manhattan to being a national story that was the talk of many different campaigns. So this isn't something that just sort of erupted out of nowhere. Each of these cycles has underlying it, I would argue, an acceptance of Islamophobic bias in the United States, an advancement of Islamophobic bias in the United States, and biases that are associated with it, like anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab bias. And you saw that this weekend, most recent example, when former Speaker Pelosi essentially equated pro-Palestinian protesters to people supporting Russian outcomes. So essentially, if you go out and you protest on behalf of civilians who are being killed at a rate that the International Court of Justice said could be genocide and has allowed a court case to advance around the probability that it is genocide, we have leaders here in the United States essentially saying that these demonstrators have nefarious purposes, support nefarious organizations, and regimes hostile to the United States, which is utterly ridiculous. So it's important to know this is cyclic. And I think the other thing that is important to understand is the amazing resilience that we're seeing from particularly Palestinian communities, but Arab communities and Muslim communities, and then the coalition that's come together to oppose Israeli apartheid is made up of Muslims, Christians, Jews, Arabs, people of Asian American descent, people of African American descent. It's very important to recognize this coalition has remained strong in the face of ongoing bad news. There was recently a protest in Washington, D.C. The organizers announced that the attendance at that protest was 400,000 people. That is not a small thing in January when it's cold. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking about the work that we in the Research and Advocacy Department at CAIR did. Our caseload, we work on individual advocacy cases. So like those instances that I talked about earlier on where individuals were targets, our caseload went up 678% in October. During the last quarter, we did 22 separate trainings for people to help them understand how to better message what they're talking about and how to have more impactful protests. We produced the first analysis of how what's going on in Gaza is affecting civil rights here in the United States. So all of these things are going on, and that's just our department. The larger CAIR as an institution has also moved a tremendous amount of work. And then you move further out, and there's all these different organizations doing great work to pursue justice for Palestinian humanity. And I point that out to you because that resilience is impressive. That's what keeps us that work in this profession going. And it's going to have positive outcomes in the end. I know it's very difficult to see it in the moment, particularly with the positions the Biden administration has decided to adopt. That's unfortunate. But I can tell you, as somebody who's been working on issues surrounding Palestine for a couple of decades now, the conversation today is much clearer in the sense that Palestinians are human beings. And this is a decades-long conflict in which they have faced occupation and apartheid. So that's my comments for the moment. We have one question in the chat. How do we help school teachers asked to leave the classroom for teaching Palestinian history and curriculum? Well, the first thing to do is to go to CAIR.com and file a complaint with us, because that's the way we know that you need that help. And certainly our attorneys will look at it. If our attorneys decide that it doesn't need a legal case, it can have advocacy intervention, they'll pass it over to my team. So we're there, we're ready to help you out. It's something that we've seen a lot of, but each school district is different. So I can't give you a broad brush answer. You can also go to Islamophobia.org, where we've placed a number of different resources that includes how to speak out on this issue, particularly in recognition that people in education settings and people in their places of employment have been targeted and impacted. So we do have a list of best practices from our attorneys about how you can go out and have that speech and how to document any particular backlash you might get. So unfortunate to hear. We thought it was important to give everyone this quick update. Appreciate everyone spending some time with us, whether it's live now or later on in the evening. And inshallah, we will keep working on it. And we look forward to working with you to get to the day where there is a free Palestine that is no longer subject to apartheid, occupation, and genocide.